Hi, everyone. It is my great honor to present here today, and I really appreciate the organizing committee of BEAL for inviting me and accommodating with my current situation. Let me start sharing my screen. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about WH words in East Asian languages, namely Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, regarding their intonation and meaning. First, let me start with what is special about the WH words in East Asian languages. In many languages, including East Asian languages, WH question words can be used to indicate a non-question reading. For example, the word shama in Chinese can mean either what or something. So when you say 他以为我买了什么, it can either mean he thinks that I bought something, or what does he think I bought? To emphasize the ambiguity of WH words, I'll sometimes refer to them as WH indeterminates. WH indeterminates are observed in a lot of languages all over the world. In his extensive typological study of indefinites, Martin Hasselmath reported that the majority of the languages that he studied turned out to have WH indeterminates. In this picture, he presents 100 languages that he investigated, and the black ones have WH indeterminates, whereas the white ones don't. So you can see that the black signs are all over the world, and that gives us a nice visualization of how widespread WH indeterminates are. It's not confined to a specific language family or a specific region in the world. And East Asian languages exhibit particularly rich inventories of WH indeterminates. For example, this table presents various expressions based on a single WH word who in Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. You can observe that the same WH morpheme is shared in all these different expressions, including interrogative, existential, universal, negative polarity, and free choice. So for example, in Korean, the interrogative word 누구, who, can be used to indicate existential someone, 누구 or 누군가, and universal everyone, 누구나, NPI anyone, 누구도, and the free choice anyone, 누구라도. And this paradigm is observed not only for who, but also for almost all other WH expressions like what, where, when, or which person, what kind of object, and so on. So in today's talk, I will focus on the comparison between an interrogative reading and indefinite or existential reading of WH indeterminates. The indefinite use of WH words exhibits an interesting typological pattern because the three languages all differ in the possible forms of WH indefinites. Chinese allows the bare form of WH words, so the same form as the interrogative, to be used as indefinites. So for example, the word she can also mean someone and who, but Japanese requires WH words to combine with a particle to receive an indefinite reading. So for example, the word dare, who, needs the indefinite marker ka to mean someone. Korean allows both types of WH indefinites. For example, 누구, who, can mean someone by itself or by combining with the explicit indefinite marker 인가 or 은가 as a shortened form. So the distinction between interrogative and indefinite is rather clear in Japanese because it is always disambiguated by morphology, the marker. In Chinese, however, while the two readings have the same form, the indefinite use is rather limited to specific context, so-called non-veridical context, such as yes-no questions, conditional clauses, and so on. We're going to talk about the details soon. Korean shows the highest level of ambiguity because the same form can be used for both interrogative and indefinite, and there's no restriction on the context where WH indefinites can appear. So while there are some differences, what is shared by all three languages is they have indefinites that look partially or entirely the same as interrogatives, and all three languages are WH in situ languages, so WH questions and statements have the same word order. So these facts lead to the problem of potential or substantial ambiguity resolution while we're processing sentences containing WH words in these languages. So in today's talk, I would like to talk about the role of intonation or sentential prosody in processing sentences with WH indeterminates. Since the intonation pattern can differ from language to language and dialect to dialect, I'm going to focus on the data from what is commonly considered the standard dialect, such as Seoul Korean, Tokyo Japanese, and Beijing Mandarin, otherwise specified. But the semantic and phonological principles behind the analysis presented in this talk are supposed to apply to any language and any dialect. Also, I've mostly worked on Korean, which is my native language, so the talk will be largely devoted to set up the theoretical background using Korean data. And then we can extend our discussion to Japanese and Chinese. So let's start with the Korean WH words. A Korean sentence containing a WH word can be highly ambiguous, as I mentioned, because of the ambiguity of WH words, as well as the ambiguity of sentence endings. This sentence, 미나가 누구를 만나, 미나 who met, has at least three different readings. It can be a WH question, who is Mina seeing? Or a yes-no question, is Mina seeing someone? Or even a statement, Mina is seeing someone. This three-way ambiguity is so widespread in Korean because although there are sentence endings that explicitly indicate whether the sentence is a statement or a question, like 다 for statements and 가 for questions, but there's a clear tendency to use neutral sentence endings like in this example, especially in spoken Korean. Then the question is, how can we tell which reading is really intended when we have three possible readings? Of course, there should be context, but even without context, native Korean speakers can distinguish all the readings without much difficulty. That is because each different reading involves a different intonation. For example, let me read this sentence in these three different meanings: WH question, yes, no question, and the statement. So the first one is 미나가 누구를 만나? The second one, 미나가 누구를 만나? Third one, 미나가 누구를 만나? So even if you don't speak Korean, I think you can easily tell the intonation differs for all three readings. So the question is how? How do they differ? So how can we describe the differences? First, among the three sentence types, a yes-no question reading is easily distinguished by the sharp rising contour at the end of the sentence, like 미나가 누구를 만나? So this seems to be a general consensus in the literature. So it is like the H boundary tone in terms of auto segmental metrical theory. When it comes to the distinction of statements and WH questions, two different prosodic aspects have been discussed in the literature. One is the prominence of the WH word phrase, and the other is phonological phrasing or dephrasing after the WH phrase. Let's first talk about the prominence, which is easier to explain. A number of Korean researchers have argued that the WH phrase becomes prominent when it means an interrogative. In the previous example, when you compare the assertion 미나가 누구를 만나 and the WH question 미나가 누구를 만나, you can notice that the WH word 누구를 sounds more prominent in the WH question. Phonetically, that prominence is realized with higher pitch or extended pitch range on the WH word. The other prosodic feature that helps disambiguate the meaning of WH words is phonological phrasing. That is, in WH questions, a WH word forms a single prosodic phrase with the following words in the sentence. For example, in the indefinite reading, the statement reading, the WH word 누구를 and the following verb 만나 create separate prosodic phrases, but in the interrogative reading, WH question reading, 누구를 and 만나 belong to the same prosodic phrase. So practically in WH questions, there's no prosodic boundary between the WH word and the following word. So it is often called dephrasing in WH questions. But how do we know if there's a prosodic boundary or not? I'm going to follow a widely adopted model of Korean intonation by Sanachan and introduce the notion of accentual phrase that is relevant to our discussion. So Chun's model follows the basic assumption of the autosegmental metrical theory. That is, intonation contour of human language is described by combinations of two abstract pitch levels, high and low. When it comes to Seoul Korean, the basic intonation pattern of an accentual phrase is characterized as either LH, LH, or an HH, LH sequence, depending on the property of the first syllable. For example, when you compare these two noun phrases, 영민이가 and 철민이가, you can notice that their tonal patterns are the same except for the first syllable. 영민이가 is LH, LH and 철민이가 is HH, LH. So that is if the first syllable in the AP starts with a tense or aspirated obstruent, like in 철민이가, the first tone is realized as high. Otherwise, the first tone is low. In the rest of the talk, I just use the first pattern, LH, LH, for a simple illustration. So in most cases, a content word in Korean corresponds to one accentual phrase, but there are cases where the accentual phrase boundaries are collapsed, such as in WH questions. The basic tone pattern is basic tone pattern of AP, LH, LH is fully realized when the AP consists of four or more syllables. In that case, the first LH fall on the first two syllables, and the last LH fall on the last two syllables. And if there are any further syllables in between the second and the P note, they show gradually descending pitch contour. If the AP consists of fewer than four syllables, like one or two or three syllables, only the first L and the last H are fully realized, and the AP shows a gradually rising pitch contour. For illustration, we can compare the intonations of these two sentences. In the first one, all the words consist of four or more syllables, and in the second one, all words consist of three syllables. I deliberately displayed these sentences in Korean orthography Hangul because it gives a nice visualization of how many syllables are there, because one character block corresponds to one syllable. So the first sentence sounds like 민준이가 영아한테 좋아한다고 말했어요. And the second sentence sounds like 영아가 나한테 인형을 줬어요. And I'll read these sentences very slowly to demonstrate how the intonation matches the model. So the first letter, the first word in the first sentence is four syllables, 민준이가, so it is LH, LH, and 민준이가 영아한테 좋아한다고 말했어요. The last AP has a rather flat tone because the sentence final tone overrides the AP final tone at the end of the sentence. And the second sentence is like 영아가 나한테 인형을 줬어요. So I think these sentences show nice contrast when we have a different size of APs. Now, let's go back to our question, the prosodic distinction between statements and WH questions in terms of phrasing. It has been noted that in WH questions, the WH word and the following words form a single accentual phrase, AP2. We can call this post-WHD phrasing because when it occurs, the accentual phrase boundaries after the WH words are deleted. Let's see the details on how changes in phrasing affect the actual intonation. Back to the previous sentence, 미나가 누구를 만나? When the WH word in the sentence is interpreted as indefinite, so the statement, the sentence contains three accentual phrases, and all the accentual phrases consist of three or fewer syllables in this case. So each of them has a rising contour, like 미나가 누구를 만나. On the other hand, when the WH word in this sentence is interpreted as an interrogative and the sentence gets WH question reading, the WH phrase 누구를 and the following word 만나 form a single big accentual phrase. Now this big AP has 5 syllables, so the full LH tones are realized, so the pitch contour changes and the sentence sounds like 미나가 누구를 만나? 미나가 누구를 만나? Now I guess you became familiar with the notion of both prominence and phrasing to disambiguate the meaning of WH words in Korean. Then the question is, which is the crucial factor, prominence or phrasing? Before answering this question, I like to note another factor that we need to consider in the discussion of the meaning and intonation of WH indeterminates, which is the scope configuration of WH indeterminates. So it has been noted that syntactic islands, such as if clauses, do not allow scope-bearing elements to escape out of them. Okay, so this is too much technicality, but let's take an example. For example, let's consider this sentence, if everyone comes to the party, May will be happy. It really means May will be happy if everyone comes to the party. Wide scope reading of everyone would be something like, for everyone, for each person, May will be happy if that person comes to the party. So this sentence doesn't mean this. I mean, it doesn't have this wide scope reading. So we say that everyone cannot take scope out of if clauses. So they cannot be interpreted out of if clause. So that's why it's called an island. You cannot escape from it. However, it has long been noticed in the literature, at least since Fodor and Sag 1982, that indefinites take a free scope. So the existential expressions like someone can be interpreted out of syntactic islands. So they can take a scope even out of if clauses. For example, this sentence, if someone comes to the party, May will be happy, can mean either if anyone comes to the party, May will be happy, or there's a certain someone such that if that person comes to the party, May will be happy. So in the first reading, someone is interpreted inside the if clause, and someone in the second reading is interpreted outside if clause. So we can conclude that indefinites can take wide scope. By the way, if you are a semanticist, I said the meaning of the given sentence is like these paraphrases, but these are not the exact meaning because narrow scope of someone and anyone are actually different. Or just to keep using these kind of paraphrases just to emphasize the difference between narrow scope reading and wide scope reading. Um, so what I just said is about the scope of regular indefinites, like someone, that are not morphologically related to WH words. But what about indefinites that are morphologically related to WH words, WH indeterminates? So when it comes to indefinites that have exactly the same form as interrogatives, it has been argued that they cannot take a free scope. So, for example, Bruning 2007 provided many examples from many languages. And as shown in this example, the sentence, I'll be happy if who comes to the party can only mean I'll be happy if anyone comes to the party, but it cannot mean there is a someone such that I'll be happy if that person comes to the party. So I just want to note that this restriction only applies to, well, this restriction is known to apply only for indefinites that have the same form as interrogatives. So it doesn't apply to indefinites, WH indefinites that have an external explicit marker like the Japanese ones. But still, but this is supposed to apply to Korean ones and Chinese ones that have the same form as interrogatives. But the thing is, this restriction doesn't seem to hold in Korean. And yeah, So here are my hypotheses. First, I think we're between phonological phrasing and the phonological prominence, no, phonetic prominence. I think it is phonological phrasing that plays a crucial role in distinguishing the meaning of WH indeterminates. And what about phonetic prominence? Where back to the question of scope, I think WH indefinites can take wide scope. And the role of phonetic prominence is to increase the possibility of a wide scope interpretation of WH indeterminates. So to test these hypotheses, I conducted a perception experiment in Korean. And this is the design of the experiment I came up with. It compares two positive factors, WH pitch raising and post-WH phrasing to test my first hypothesis. So post-WH phrasing is more important than WH pitch raising. And since my second hypothesis is about the scope configuration, I chose sentences that could have different scope readings. So all the target stimuli in my experiment contained a WH word embedded in an if clause for different scope readings, wide and narrow scope, and they ended in a neutral form so that the sentence was ambiguous between an assertion and a question. So here's an example. 약에 뭐가 들어가면 위험해. So we have WH word, 뭐, and ka is just a nominative marker, not indefinite marker. And 뭐가 들어가면, 면 is if, and it is an embedded clause. So when it is interpreted as a WH question, it's like, what is the thing such that it is dangerous if it gets into this reagent? So it's very mouthful translation because English doesn't allow a WH word take scope out of if clause. So if clause is also a WH island in English, but in Korean and many other languages, you can have WH question, a matrix WH question where WH word is located in the embedded clause, the if clause. And when the sentence is interpreted as a statement, there are still two possibilities, a narrow scope reading of indefinite and a wide scope reading of indefinite. So if more in this sentence is interpreted as something, or it can be either, it is dangerous if anything gets into this reagent. So it doesn't matter what it is. And a wide scope reading is there's a certain something such that it is dangerous if that thing gets into this reagent. And again, where all the sentences ended in a neutral form, so that the sentence was ambiguous between an assertion and a question. So I didn't mention yet another reading, a yes, no question. So this sentence can also be interpreted as a yes, no question. But as I mentioned before, yes, no question readings are distinguished by its sentence of final intonation. And in the experiment, I eliminated that possibility by keeping all the sentence ending intonation relatively low. And I prepared the audio stimuli by speech synthesis. So first, a native speaker of Korean read the stimuli as statements without any focus or prominence on any item. So these were used as the base set of audio stimuli for further manipulation. So the first set of stimuli was created by just stylizing the pitch track as a series of dots like this. And this stylization was to make further manipulation easy and consistent. So instead of the wiggly curvy lines, we can just stylize the pitch contour set of dots and the interpolation of between them. And for the second group, the pitch target of the pitch target on the WH phrase here was raised to the point of the corresponding point in the WH questions. So the same speaker recorded both statement version and the WH question version of the stimuli, so that WH question reading the recordings were used as comparison. This one, this one represents a hypothetical prosody where the WH phrase is prominent, but there is no rephrasing after that. For the third group of stimuli, the pitch contour after the WH word was smoothed to replicate the rephrasing effect. This one represents another hypothetical prosody where the WH word itself is not prominent, but the post-WH phrasing is there. The final group had both WH pitch raising and post-WH pitch smoothing to represent the typical intonation pattern of a WH question. Then the participants were asked to listen to the stimuli and choose the meaning of the sentence. Yes, no question, WH question, a statement with a wide scope indefinite, and a statement with a narrow scope indefinite. Since this is a very complicated judgment, I wanted to reduce the cognitive load during the experiment. So I made the task a sequence of 2 binary choices and in the next step there's another binary choice, either this or this, so that the participants first responded if the sentence sounded like a question or a statement, and then they were asked to choose one of the paraphrases of the sentence. For example, if they chose question, then the next task was to decide whether the paraphrase of the whole sentence is more like whether or not it is dangerous. If anything gets into the reagent, then it's a yes no question. And what is the thing such that it is dangerous if it gets into reagent, then it's a WH question. And similarly, the wide scope reading and narrow scope reading were also provided as paraphrases like these. So after they did this two-step processes, they gave what they ended up giving the ultimate reading of the sentence, either one of these 4. Since the target stimuli were controlled in the way that the yes no question readings were not available, I included yes no question stimuli as filler sentences. Okay, so here's the results. So this graph shows the proportion of WH question responses for each prosody type. So how many times the stimuli were perceived as WH question. So you can see that the first prosody type, no WH prominence, no post-WH phrasing was almost never perceived as a WH question, because This doesn't have any prosodic property of WH question, and it's the typical indefinite prosody. And the last prosody type, with both WH pitch raising and post-WH dephrasing, was largely perceived as a WH question. It's not close to 100% because I only manipulated the pitch, and the other cues such as duration or intensity could have interfered with the perception of the participants. What is interesting to us is the middle columns, the hypothetical prosody patterns. When WH pitch was raised but no dephrasing is followed, it was not perceived as a WH question most of the time. On the other hand, when the WH was not prominent, but there was post-WH dephrasing, it was perceived as a WH question as often as the last one. It is actually surprising that the third column was even a little bit higher than the last one. But anyway, so they were almost the same. So that means overall the results show that it is post-WH dephrasing, not WH prominence, that this decides the meaning of the WH indeterminates. And this graph shows the proportion of wide scope responses out of all statement responses. So this graph is showing the influence of a prosody in the scope rating. And the wide scope response rate was significantly higher when the pitch of the WH word was raised. But there was also a significant effect of a post-WH dephrasing in the perception of a scope configuration. So the effect of dephrasing in scope configuration was not part of my original hypothesis, but it can be explained naturally within my hypothesis because post-WH dephrasing could enhance the prominence of the WH indeterminate, because if all the post-WH words lose their accentual phrase tones due to dephrasing and sort of like flatted, then the WH word would become perceptually more prominent, even if it does not receive a higher pitch. So if this is the case, the higher rate of the for the stimuli with dephrasing will still be attributed to the prominence of WH indeterminates. To summarize the results, the experimental results suggest that post-WH dephrasing is a decisive factor in perceiving WH questions, while prominence, such as a high pitch on the WH phrase, is not. And the prominence on the WH word rather increases the possibility of a wide scope interpretation. So it has more to do with the scope configuration rather than the meaning of the WH word itself. Now let's talk about Japanese. In Japanese, unlike Korean or Chinese, an explicit indefinite marker is required to turn a WH word to an indefinite. For example, a bare WH word dare can only mean who, not someone, unless it is followed by the particle ka. So dareka means someone. However, a WH question and its declarative counterpart still seem quite similar in Japanese. When you compare this pair of sentences containing WH indeterminates highlighted in red, you can notice that they have almost the same sequence of words, namely Naoya, what, bar, drank. But their meanings are different. The first one is the assertion, Naoya drank something at the bar, while the second one is a question, what did Naoya drink at the bar? They have some differences in their form, like the existential marker ka after the WH word in the first sentence, or the question marker no at the end of the second sentence, but they don't differ in terms of word order because Japanese is a WH language. They show a clear contrast in terms of intonation, however. Here's a representative pitch contour for each of the two sentences. In sentence A, where the WH word is used as an indefinite, each word is realized with a pitch peak because Japanese is a pitch, lexical pitch accent language. So it sounds like 直哉が何かを飲み屋で飲んだ. In sentence B, however, in WH question, you can see two distinct properties compared to the sentence A. First, the pitch of the WH word is boosted as marked by the arrow. Second, the pitch between the WH word and the question particle is compressed as indicated by the shaded area. The lexical accents of post-WH words are weakened or suppressed, so the overall pitch contour after the WH word becomes flatter. So the sentence sounds like 直哉が何を飲み屋で飲んだの? So Japanese WH questions share the same prosodic characteristics as the Korean ones, namely WH prominence and post-WH dephrasing. Even though the two languages have quite different intonation systems, Korean doesn't have lexical accents, while Japanese does. First, WH prominence is achieved by WH pitch boosting, which enhances the prominence of the WH word. This part is similar to Korean. Second, post-WH dephrasing is achieved by de-accenting words after the WH word, because the phonological model for Japanese allows one prosodic phrase, one minor phrase, to have only one lexical accent. So it's actually easier to explain than Korean intonation system, because in Japanese, it's really when you have intonation or minor phrases, there's only one pitch accent. So if you have one pitch accent in a certain area, then you can identify that as a single phrase. Then we can ask the same question, which is more crucial in Japanese, WH prominence or post-WH dephrasing? By the way, there's a debate whether the pitch compression is phonetic or phonological, that is, whether the post-WH words still retain their lexical accents after pitch compression, or they lose the accent. So it seems like the pitch contour after the WH word is pretty much flat, but there's still a little bit of bump. So it seems like it's not entirely deleted. I mean, the pitch accents are not entirely deleted in this case. But, well, depending on your view, if it is phonological, we can state that it's a post-WH phrasing, just like the Korean. So back to our question, the important the prosodic property in perception of WH indeterminates. Here I'm going to present one of the earliest experimental observations by Kikuo Maekawa. A perception experiment was conducted in his study to identify the crucial intonational property in deciding the meaning of WH indeterminates in Japanese. And Japanese does not allow a WH indefinite to have the same form as we have mentioned before. It is impossible to construct a perfect minimal pair consisting of a WH question and its indefinite counterpart with exactly the same segments. Instead, pseudo-minimal pairs of a WH question and the corresponding yes-no question were created for the experiment like this. Nani ka mieru and nani ga mieru. So this was possible because the indefinite marker ka is similar to the nominative case marker ga, and a case marker can be dropped in spoken Japanese. So the first sentence literally means something is visible, and the second sentence is like, what is visible? This figure shows the representative pitch tracks of the two sentences. As we can expect, the WH question and the yes-no question are different in their intonation, mainly with respect to two factors. First, the peak F0 value of the WH word nani is higher in a WH question than a yes-no question, which indicates the prominence of the WH indeterminates, meaning the prominence of WH interrogative. Second, the F0 bump in the verb mieru due to its lexical accent is not observed in WH question, which indicates a post-WH phrasing. So the WH indefinite version sounds like 何か見える, and the in WH interrogative version sounds like 何が見える? To compare the relative significance of these two factors in perception, Maekawa sensei conducted an experiment using synthesized speech by varying the pitch of the WH word and the verb. The figure on the right illustrates all sound manipulations schematically. So they were all combinations, including the typical yes/no question. So the host, there's no WH prominence, but there's a pitch accent after the WH word. And the the typical WH question intonation, which is as WH prominence and post WH decreasing. And there are mixed ones like WH boosting, and the lexical accent of the verb is retained, and no WH boosting, but the lexical accent of verb is deleted. So there was additional manipulation because the segmental difference between ka and ga and ka can simply signal a different sentence. So the particle part was replaced with white noise. So the stimuli sounded like, all the stimuli sounded like nani, mieru, and the participants were asked to decide the meaning of the sentence based on what they heard. And the results show that the pitch contour of the verb is far more important than that of the WH word. In the graph on the left, the thick line and the dotted line indicate the presence and absence of WH prominence respectively. And we can see that the two kinds of lines largely overlap, and there is not much difference between them on the graph. On the other hand, well, this actually shows two different graphs on the left side and the right, this side and this side. And let's focus on the right hand side. So the x coordinate, the horizontal x indicates the pitch height of the verb, the d value here. And we can clearly see that when this x coordinate value decreases, which means the lexical accent of the verb is getting lost, the y coordinate value increases, which indicates the percentage of the WH question judgment. In other words, the steep slope indicates the significant contribution of post-WH phrasing to the perception of WH questions, regardless of whether WH prominence is present or not. So the experimental results show that post-WH phrasing is far more important than WH prominence in perceiving WH questions in Japanese. Last but not least, let's take a look at Chinese WH indeterminates. Observing the meaning and intonation of WH indeterminates in Chinese might seem more challenging than in Korean and Japanese. First, unlike Korean and Japanese, Chinese WH indeterminates can have an indefinite reading only in certain restricted environments. Often, those indefinite licensing environments are characterized in terms of non-veridicality. Veridicality means an assertion of the truth, so a non-veridical sentence is a sentence which doesn't claim the truth of its content. That is, here are examples of non-veridical contexts. So they include negation, yes, no question, a, not a questions, if clauses, and so on. So these kind of contexts license an indefinite reading of WH indeterminates in Chinese. So you can say 他不喜欢什么, or 他喜欢什么吗, and so on. And and these can indicate an indefinite reading. This can license an indefinite reading of WH words. And there are many more licensing contexts. And actually, the recent literature suggests that the scope of those contexts is not exactly limited to non-veridicality. And there should be something more going on. But the bottom line is this. So you need a certain licensing expression, whatever it is, to get an indefinite reading of WH indeterminates in Chinese. So if you just say, for example, in the negative sentence, if you don't say this, and 他喜欢什么, then it can only mean what does he like, but can never mean he likes something. So you really need a certain licensing environment to have an indefinite reading of WH question, WH indeterminate in Chinese. So here are more examples of WH indefinite licensing expressions in case you are interested. Another challenge in describing the meaning of intonation and meaning and intonation of Chinese WH indeterminates is that the Chinese is a lexical tonal language. So almost every syllable has its intrinsic tone, which is phonetically manifested mainly with pitch, F0, like ma, 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 which can interfere with the sentential intonation. However, we can still detect and describe the sentential level or global intonation in terms of those tones, just like we can do that in lexical stress languages like English or in lexical pitch accent languages like Japanese by observing how the intrinsic lexical prosodic property is enhanced or reduced because of the syntactic or informational structure of the sentence. That means when it comes to the distinction between an indefinite and an interrogative readings of WH indeterminates, we can construct a minimal pair or pseudo-minimal pair so that we can single out the prosodic effect of the meaning of the WH indeterminates, regardless of whatever lexical tones each word in the sentence has. For example, Here's a pseudo-minimal pair of indefinite and interrogative version of she. Yeah. Where the indefinite reading is licensed by the non-veridical predicate 好像. Their pitch accents, their pitch contours show that when the WH word has an indefinite reading, the lexical tone is reduced to a level tone instead of the original second tone, she, which is clear or even reinforced in the interrogative reading. This difference in terms of WH prominence is a clear consensus in the literature. The WH word is prominent when it is interrogative and not prominent when it is indefinite. And if we take a look at a longer sentence, we can observe further differences in the intonation. There were many great observations in a recent dissertation by Yang 2018. So I'm going to present some parts of her analysis that are relevant to the discussion here. In WH questions, the pitch range of the words after the WH word is reduced, which shows the typical post-WH pitch compression as observed in Korean and Japanese. In this graph, the peak here indicates the highest pitch of the WH word, which is higher when it is interrogative than indefinite. And after that peak, the overall pitch range is narrowed for the WH question than for the statement. As far as I know, this phenomenon hasn't been discussed in terms of phrasing, but it'll be interesting to think about that possibility. Another interesting observation of intonation at the sentence level is about duration. First, the duration of the WH word was longer in WH questions than the statement. This is kind of expected because usually a longer duration is associated with greater prominence. So we can expect that a WH interrogative is longer than its indefinite counterpart. What is truly interesting here is the duration of the pre-WH reason is shorter in the WH questions than in statements. You can see that before the WH word shama, the black bars are all higher than the corresponding gray bars, indicating that each word is longer in a statement than in a WH question. This durational difference is most striking at the verb. So the duration of the verb is much longer in the statement than the WH question, which is easy to explain when we assume that the verb is the focus of the sentence when it is used with an indefinite object. But it's still interesting that this durational difference is observed even at the subject. In the post-WH reason, no statistically significant durational effect differences were reported. This is another interesting observation, and I'm curious how it should be explained. To summarize what we have seen so far, the intonational differences between the indefinite and interrogative readings are not only found on the WH word itself, but also found all over the sentences. I haven't found any literature that compares the influence of local WH prominence and that of a global prosody, but I can point to one perception experiment that shows the influence of the global prosody detached from local prosody. The experiment by Yang used an audio gating paradigm, which is participants listened to the beginning of the sentence, then completed the rest of the sentences the rest of the sentence by choosing one of the two continuations, WH question or statement. So this is for answering the question how early the speakers can predict the close type, whether it's a statement or a WH question. For example, the participants listen to the very first word of the sentence, which works as gate A in this case, and then predicted whether the sentence would continue as a question or a statement. So they listened to both versions of what the first word of the both recordings, interrogative and indefinite, statement and WH questions. Then they listened to the first two words and predicted the rest of the sentence. Then were the same for the first three words, the first four words, both for interrogative recordings and indefinite recordings. Then, by observing the prediction results, we can see at which point listeners can perceive the prosodic differences between WH questions and their declarative counterparts. If they can't perceive the difference, then the prediction must be just 50-50. The results suggest that listeners start to perceive the prosodic difference quite early, even at the beginning of the sentence. The red check marks indicate the correct prediction, and after listening to the first word, after the second word, and after listening to all the words before the WH word. So we can see that the bias toward the correct prediction right after listening to the first word, which is clearly departed from 50-50 chance. And even before listening to the WH word, the listeners have a great chance to get the sentence type correctly. This experimental result suggests the importance of a global intonation, the intonation of the whole sentence in the interpretation of WH indeterminates. Because if the prominence of the WH word, the local prosody, is the only cue to an interrogative reading, the listeners wouldn't have been able to predict the meaning of the sentence until they reach the WH word. Here's a general discussion on what we have seen so far. Let's first talk about the global intonation. In Korean and Japanese, deep phrasing after the WH word causes a strong preference for a WH question reading. In Chinese, the intonation before the WH word provides a certain amount of information about the meaning of the WH word. I want to note that this summary doesn't mean that only the post-WH region is important in Korean Japanese and only the pre-WH region is important in Chinese. These are just what we can learn from the literature, and it'll be interesting future work to investigate what's going on in the pre-WH region in Korean and Japanese and what's going on in the post-WH region in Chinese. Then why would global prosody or phrasing be an important factor in deciding the meaning of WH indeterminates? One very interesting and inspiring argument is made by Novin Richards. He suggests that in WH questions, the WH phrase and the corresponding complementizer are separated by as few prosodic boundaries as possible. This argument is fascinating in that it provides a universal principle for both WH movement languages and WH in situ languages. Namely, WH movement languages follow this principle by moving the WH word next to the complementizer so that there is no prosodic boundary between them. So if we have WH and originally have some phrase boundaries and you have a complementizer, then you can just move WH word to the next to the complementizer. And there's no boundary between them. And in WH and C2 languages, follow this principle by moving phrase boundaries between the WH word and the complementizer prosodically to achieve the same goal. Now let's talk about the local prosody. Prosodic prominence of the WH word is observed in all three languages in WH questions. However, experimental studies suggest that WH prominence itself does not yield an interrogative reading, at least in Korean and Japanese. Whether WH prominence is a decisive factor in perceiving WH questions in Chinese is, I think, yet to be explored, but at least it seems clear that it is not the only factor. There's a role of the global prosody too. Regarding prosodic prominence, there are observations that it has something to do with the scope configuration rather than the WH feature. Namely, it increases the probability of a wide scope reading. And this coincides with the observation that the prominence on regular indefinites also has something to do with scope configuration. For example, English some can take wide scope, but its phonetically reduced version some cannot take wide scope. And then, if it is true that some languages don't allow their WH indefinites to take wide scope, as Ben Bruning argued, then it might be the case that such languages have a prosodic constraint that WH indefinites are never realized as prominent. Indeed, Chinese WH indefinites are known to be unable to take wide scope and are always prosodically unmarked or reduced. I'll stop here for today's presentation, but there are many more interesting stories about the meaning and intonation of WH indeterminates and so many topics for future studies. Here are some selected references, and you can find most of the references in this talk in my 2019 paper, which is available on my personal website. You can Google my name to find my website. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I look forward to your questions and comments.